in 1933 at the Bayan Interior in 1962. His mate, Yvonne, was Dora's only full sister. They had two brothers. Fernando was then 29. He had come to Arambepe in his early teens, had been living with Yvonne for 6 years. After a year of courting, which had begun at the St. John's celebration one June, they decided to elope. One evening, Yvonne went to her house and packed a few of her things to take to the house that Fernando had been building for his future family. She moved the rest of her possessions after a few weeks. Their first child, a daughter, came a year later. By 1980, they had 10 children, and during the almost quarter century of their union, Yvonne had miscarried 6 times. Fernando, an illiterate man with no formal education, remembered the total number of his progeny was 10, but he had to count names on his fingers to tell me how many girls and boys. When he was 8 years old, Fernando ran away from a fairy tale home, complete with wicked stepmother. Following Fernando's mother's death, his father had taken another wife. Fernando decided to leave home when he saw his stepmother put his younger brother's hand in the fire as punishment for taking something. The runaway skirted Salvador and was taken in by a man in Itapoan. After 8 days, beat him, spurring further flight to Abrantes, Arambepe's district seat. In recalling his childhood, Fernando stressed the incidents of physical abuse. A man in Abrantes lodged him for 4 years and beat him for lying. In 1942, at the age of 12, Fernando moved to Arambepe, where he worked successfully as a mule driver for 2 businessmen. They gave him room and board in their homes in the central square. He liked the first, another outsider, better than the second. Prudencio, the landowner's agent. Fernando recalled another beating from Prudencio's wife, the old school teacher. Fernando started fishing when he was 18. As an immigrant, he had no kin ties to captains or crews and started fishing with a man from Jawa, whose boat was temporarily fishing out of Arambepe. In 1960, Fernando became captain and half-owner with a local businesswoman of a sailboat. In the mid-1960s, he joined the other captains who were dissolving their relationships with non-fishing owners for full ownership. I don't want to have to fish and divide my profit with someone who sits on shore doing nothing while I do all the work. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. In the mid-1960s, Fernando was a reasonably vigorous and successful captain owner. He followed a behavioral model provided by people like Tomé. Still, Fernando was never as daring, innovative, or enterprising, and this showed up in his good but unspectacular catches. Fernando maintained a stable crew, using ritual kinship to compensate for his lack of kin ties and legal marriage links with other villagers. Enjoying the good health of a man in his 30s, Fernando fished regularly. He varied his fishing strategy with the seasons, but he never strayed far from fishing patterns set by others and by tradition. This pattern of following rather than leading persisted into the 1970s, when Fernando was one of the last captain owners to withdraw from the Fishermen's Cooperative, which had given him a loan to motorize his boat. In 1980, he was one of just 2 people still following the old pattern of daytime fishing in Arambepe's traditional banks, distant nighttime ice fishing. In the mid-1960s, I shared villagers' impressions of Fernando as an ordinary, respected, non-controversial good man. My perception changed during my 1973 visit. Of all the Arambeperos I spent time with that year, Fernando seemed the most fearful and hostile toward change. Other social scientists have observed that outsiders often exhibit the strongest antipathy toward external forces and people. Fernando provides an excellent example, as does my 1973 reaction to the hippies. So uneasy was Fernando about his nighttime visits to the summer house we were renting south of Arambepe, he began carrying a revolver for protection. To my knowledge, no one in Arambepe had possessed such a weapon in the mid-1960s, and gun ownership was still rare in 1973. More than my other friends, Fernando reiterated that thieves and armed robbers would surely try to storm the domicile of the Americans, who they think must be rich. These would be outsiders, of course. You have nothing to fear from the Arambeperos. Fernando's fear was strong and contagious, and his warnings soon unnerved me. I suspected every set of headlights that crept into our isolated neighborhood after sundown. "Get a gun," he said, "otherwise you will be killed." In our absence one evening, Fernando got the idea of throwing firecrackers from our windows to convince would-be thieves we were armed. Fernando was also more vocal than the other villagers in denouncing other outsiders, the hippies, for licentiousness. Another sign of Fernando's unease was his excessive alcohol consumption, in sharp contrast to his previous habits. In the 1960s, Fernando had hardly ever drunk cachaca, but in 1973 he requested not just beer but ample glasses of Bacardi rum when he visited us. Alberto's drinking habits provide a contrast. In the 1960s, he always took at least one shot of cachapa each evening to warm up after the day's fishing. He remained a controlled and moderate drinker in 1980. Fernando, by contrast, had gone from one extreme to the other. In 1973, the people of Arambepe felt insecure about many changes: Tibur's pollution, hippie stragglers, weekend hordes of boisterous outsiders, a booming economy, and a dramatically increased cash flow. Alberto's family expressed its unease through his wife's psychosomatic illnesses and his daughter's uncontrolled spirit possession. Both of them sought relief in candomblé, as eventually did Fernando, who often mentioned to me that fishermen had been accusing certain captains of using black magic. He hinted to me that other captains, including Tomé, who never did, were participating in candomblé, and this partly explained the dramatic increase in the wealth of certain people. Fernando stood out among villagers in giving a magical explanation for a down-to-earth but unfamiliar process: rapid commercialization and economic boom. When I left Arambepe in August 1973, I predicted that Fernando would go on seeking solace in alcohol and in candomblé. I based the prediction about candomblé on his belief that it contributed to economic success. I suspected that Fernando, trying to get richer himself and to guarantee his protection against others, would seek the most available magical solution. My prediction was correct, but fortunately only part. Other villagers reported that Fernando did drink too much between 1973 and 1976. Although people realized Fernando was drinking too much, they never labeled him an alcoholic. They reserved that term for someone who worked sporadically, hung out around bars, and drank even at breakfast time. Fernando also became increasingly involved in candomblé, the only captain owner to do so. He eventually became one of the main ceremonial assistants of Crispin, the spirit father in Coronas. On my return to Arambepe in 1980, I saw that Fernando's behavior had stabilized. He seemed as much at ease with himself and his lifestyle as he had been in the mid-60s. He was no longer active in candomblé, and he was clearly not an alcoholic. His drinking was limited to beer on Sunday, now customary for most men in Arambepe. Fernando had fallen a few notches in co-villagers' estimation. Some ridiculed his non-intensive fishing strategy, which usually produced small catches. Yet Fernando and his family enjoyed a pleasant lifestyle supported by boat ownership and fishing. The Tibur's salary of a son who still lived at home, and year-round rental from a brick house behind theirs, built in the early 1970s to take advantage of the tourist and hippie trade. By 1980, the modest but wise investments that Fernando and Yvonne had made in different areas of Arambepe's changing economy had enabled Fernando to withdraw from the rat race that had threatened his mental health in 1973. He and two fishermen in his crew drew unspectacular profits from a leisurely fishing schedule of 8 hours at sea, 8 to 4, weekdays only. Fernando now had time to spend with his wife, children, and grandchildren. His hostility toward outsiders turned into ambivalence. One step in his acceptance of change was his acquisition, through the baptism of his 6-year-old son, of middle-class compadres, a man and his daughter who resided in Salvador. Fernando and Yvonne had gotten to know them when they rented a house next door for weekend use. The godfather, a middle-aged man whose job entailed international travel, offered Fernando the security of a kin-like link to someone from a different social world. For Fernando, this tie made the outside world seem less mysterious and threatening than it once had been. At first I found it curious that Fernando and Yvonne had asked the man's daughter instead of his wife to stand as compadre. On reflection, I realized the choice of a younger woman ensured the link between families would last longer. Fernando continued to perceive his lack of kin ties to other villagers as a problem. He complained that he had been unable to finance a well to bring running water to his house, since the ground underneath was very rocky. If only I had relatives nearby, he said, we could split the costs. Still, Fernando had managed to expand his ritual kinship network through baptism of his 10 children and by standing as godfather for a dozen others. Despite his ritual kinship web and his economic comfort, Fernando's resentment and insecurity about outsiders had merely abated, not disappeared. Illustrating this was his exclamation for Tomé's economic decline. Fernando told me the bank had seized Tomé's family home when he had failed to repay a debt. In fact, as Alberto reported accurately, Tomé later confirmed, Tomé had decided to sell his home and buy a smaller one in order to repay debts and finance boat repairs. The result was the same, but Fernando's interpretation showed a feeling of being directly victimized by outside forces. Another of Fernando's tendencies was inaccuracy. Prior to 1980, I concluded Fernando was a less invaluable informant than Alberto, but I never stopped to consider exactly why. In 1980, I asked Fernando, Alberto, and others some of the same factual questions, and Alberto was almost always right, and Fernando often wrong, even about matters on which he should have been the expert, like the cost of diesel fuel. Fernando, the boat owner, was 20% off, while Alberto, the bartender, was on target. Fernando's inaccuracy reflected a personality that viewed the world unrealistically and suspiciously. Fernando's attraction to us was yet another expression of his ambivalence toward outsiders. He was fearful, but he was also fascinated. Like Alberto and Dora, Fernando's mental health rebounded as he grew accustomed to change, and he enjoyed a stream of modest but steady improvements in his lifestyle. By 1980, though still suspicious, he was no longer irrationally afraid of the outside world, which had generally been good to him. As an anthropologist rather than a psychologist, I can only speculate about the reasons for Fernando's extreme reaction to outsiders. Was he obsessed with fear that some people and deeds he was he obsessed with a fear that some people and deeds he thought to have left behind would follow him to Arambepe? Perhaps like us, other strangers who had discovered Arambepe in the old days, Fernando was especially possessive about the community where he had made a place for himself. Or did he, as an immigrant, attribute to other outsiders the worst of intentions as an expression of his own envious and resentful feelings toward his host community? His exaggeration of dangers to us in 1973 may also have disguised a possible unconscious wish to seize our wealth and lifestyle for himself. Or was he equating us as old-time, familiar outsiders with himself? Did he imagine that people were eager to do to us what he feared they wanted to do to him? No doubt multiple psychological factors affected Fernando in the early and mid-70s as he dealt with rapid economic and social change. Fortunately, Fernando did eventually manage to adjust. As in many cases, in many cultures, he used a drug, alcohol, and a new religion, candomblé, as temporary crutches. By 1980, this stranger had grown more independent and trustful. The outside world and its denizens, though still strange, were no longer overwhelming.